Good afternoon, everyone. This is Cindy Rogers from the Children's Safety Network at Education Development Center. I'm really pleased to welcome you to today's webinar called Distracted Driving Among Teens, What We Know About It and How to Prevent It. My colleague, Rebecca Wilmer, has a few announcements before we get started. Rebecca?
Hi there. So I have a couple tech tips. So audio is being broadcast currently through your computer speakers, and the quality of the audio depends on the speed of your internet connection. So that means if the audio is choppy, you should find a more stable internet connection, or you can listen over the phone by dialing 866-835-7973. If you are listening over the phone, please mute your computer speakers to eliminate echo. Phone lines will be muted during the presentation to eliminate any background noise. Answers to frequently asked questions are right up in the webinar instructions pod in the upper left-hand corner. And if you have questions or technical issues, you can type them into that Q&A box on the bottom left at any time. After the presentation, we will pause for the presenters to answer your questions. We also have a PDF of the slides available to download above the slide deck. To download it, you can click on PDF of the slides and then select the Download Files button to save the document to your computer. The webinar will be recorded and the archive will be sent out to all registrants within 2 weeks. All right, back to you, Cindy.
Okay. Thank you, Rebecca. So today we have two presenters who both have tremendous experience in this topic, and I greatly appreciate our speakers for accepting the challenge of sharing their expertise with us in such a limited time frame. Following both presentations, we will take time for your questions. So our first speaker is Dr. Ian Reagan, a senior research scientist at the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety. The Institute is an independent, nonprofit scientific and educational organization dedicated to reducing deaths, injuries, and property damage from motor vehicle crashes. As a human factors researcher, Dr. Reagan studies how drivers use and adapt to technology in their cars. Since joining the Institute in 2012, Ian has conducted research on such topics as crash avoidance technologies and driver distraction. Previously, he worked for the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or NHTSA, as a research psychologist. Dr. Reagan received a bachelor's degree and a doctorate in psychology from Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. Following Ian, we will hear from Dr. Dennis Thomas. Dr. Thomas's professional experience has encompassed a wide range of topics, but has primarily been focused on transportation safety. He is the Vice President of Dunlap & Associates, Inc., a consulting firm which provides research and consulting services to government, industry, and the legal profession, specializing in applying human factors, systems analysis, and risk management techniques to assist clients in understanding and solving problems. Within the field of transportation safety, Dr. Thomas has worked on the development and evaluation of a number of safety programs for passenger and commercial vehicle drivers and pedestrians and bicyclists. He has conducted extensive nationwide reviews of traditional driver ed programs, online driver education, and advanced driver education for teens. Dr. Thomas has also evaluated state-of-the-art computer-based training programs aimed at teaching teens how to manage their glances or to anticipate potentially hazardous driving situations. I'm really looking forward to hearing from both of you. And now I'll pass the platform over to Ian Reagan. Ian?
Thank you, Cindy. I'm going to jump right into it. I have a lot of information to talk to you about what the Institute knows about distracted driving as it relates specifically to teens. And before I get into that, I just want to emphasize that the Institute is a nonprofit. A lot of people think that we are a government agency, but we're not. We're fully funded by auto insurers. So to kick things off, I wanted to ask everybody a poll question. So I'll get right to it. The question is, according to NHTSA's Fatality Analysis Reporting System, cell phone use contributed to what percentage of the 35,000 plus crash fatalities that occurred in 2015? So what do you guys think? I'm seeing some people, a lot of people answering 20%. answer B. We've got 40, about an even split between people saying 20 and 50%. Just a few people, 24 respondents are saying 75%, and we have 2 people who have actually selected the right answer, which is A, 1%. And so I am going to spend some time talking in these first few slides about the numbers about distracted driving that we have from accident report data and why we don't necessarily believe those numbers. So, like I said in the question, there were 35,000 plus crash fatalities in 2015, the most recent year that NHTSA has data. Only 10% of those fatalities were attributed to drivers who were affected by distraction at the time. And among those distracted driving crashes, only 476 fatalities were associated with a driver who was involved in cell phone use that led to the fatality. So that comes out at 476. It only amounts to 1.2% of the overall crash fatalities in the U.S. for 2015. So while we believe that these numbers are suspect, we definitely can see from the numbers that are there that young drivers are overrepresented in distracted driving crashes. So just for example, the drivers in the youngest age group that we're interested in today, they account for 7% of drivers in all fatal crashes, but 9% of distracted drivers in fatal crashes, and 14% of the drivers who were using a cell phone that led to a fatal crash. So they're certainly overrepresented. And, I mentioned that I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the unreliable nature of police report crash data upon which the FARS data is largely based. So a perfect example of this unreliability in the data comes from this 2013 study that NHTSA did. So NHTSA manages a number of crash database programs. And it turns out that for this study, that they looked at 3 different crash programs. And each one of those crash programs, the NAS-GES, the NAS-CDS, and then the National Motor Vehicle Crash Causation Survey, each of those crash programs had a record of the same 380 crashes. And they each, in each case, in each state, or in each data program, they have a record of whether distraction was involved in each crash. And you can see, looking at the first row of numbers in that table, the variability there. The NAS-GES, which is based on police reports, indicated that distraction was present in 11% of those 380 crashes, whereas the National Motor Vehicle Crash Causation Survey indicated that distraction was a factor in 28% of those crashes. So which are both numbers right? Are neither correct, or only one? So in addition to the unreliable coding, when you think about the nature of crash investigations and police reports, they're filled out after the fact by police officers. We know that in a lot of cases when there is a crash that results in an injury, that the police assign an injury code that doesn't match what is given by the medical personnel when the driver gets to the hospital. And, probably a more important point for what we're talking about today in terms of the role of distraction in causing crashes, you think about the post hoc nature of these crash investigations and police reports. If it was a fatal crash, how is the police supposed to know, how are they going to find out whether or not the driver was distracted? If the drivers did survive the crash, they happen to cause a crash because they were distracted, how likely is the driver going to admit that they were distracted? In addition to that factor, there's a significant chunk of crashes that occur on the roads that go unreported to police. So those are also missing from the crash databases. So for all these reasons, we really doubt the accuracy of the numbers about distraction from the crash databases. So that being said, we do have a lot of understanding that we've gained from conducting observational studies. They give us really good insight into the prevalence of various distracted driving behaviors. And as much as I can throughout the time that I have today, I'm going to try to include, how the engagement and distraction varies across the age span. But, there are a number of different methodologies that have been used. The simplest observation method is to just have somebody out on the road and looking and seeing what people are doing. And then there are a number of methodologies that involve putting cameras and sensors in vehicles and tracking drivers out on the road as they drive to get insight into normal everyday driving. So the figure that you're looking at here comes from NHTSA's annual cell phone survey. It's a nationally representative roadside observational study where the observers are coding for cell phone use, and they code for whether the person is talking on a handheld or hands-free phone, or whether they're observed manipulating the phone. And so what you can see from this figure is the blue trend lines and the yellow trend line, which are observations and estimations of cell phone conversations. Those have sort of leveled off over the past 5 or 6, 7 years. And then you notice the red trend line, which shows the changes over the past 10 years in observed manipulation of handheld devices. And you can see that that's going up. And then I broke out the youngest age group for today's talk. You can see that the rate of observed manipulation of handheld devices is increasing at a greater rate for the youngest age group. And that's certainly a concern. So, while observed manipulation of handheld devices is increasing, one of the main points that I wanted to emphasize today was that distracted driving extends beyond cell phone use. I think recently distraction and cell phone use are synonymous, but it is important to note that people engage in a lot of distracted driving behaviors when they're out on the road. And so now hopefully I have a video that should play if you have a good connection. And so this lady here is eating an ice cream cone and smoking a cigarette, but the clip that really gets it for me is coming up here with this lady who is dipping a Tootsie Roll Pop into a pickle jar. And, that, in my mind, has got to be at least as distracting as doing something with your cell phone. Who knows? But, for those of you who couldn't see this slide that is displaying now, it kind of gets across the same point. People are doing a lot of different things when they're out on the road driving. And, we shot that video in conjunction with an observational study that we did in the Northern Virginia area. So those were normal drivers out on Interstate 66, which is a really densely traveled urban interstate. And, in the observational study that we did, we looked at about close to 17,000 vehicles that were observed. And we did the observation points at 4 different locations throughout Northern Virginia. We were observing drivers in straightaway areas as they were driving in free flow traffic. We looked at what they were doing when they were moving through an intersection with a green light, what they were doing when they were stopped at the intersection with a red light, and then when they were trying to negotiate a roundabout. So this figure kind of collapses across all the observation locations and just shows the overall prevalence of the 13 behaviors that we coded for during the study. And well, you can see that the two most common behaviors were holding a cell phone and talking on a handheld phone. There's a lot of other behaviors that don't involve cell phones, such as eating and drinking, smoking, grooming, that were also present. So, next point that I wanted to make, and this is just to kind of get at the fact that this is a complex situation that we're dealing with. Drivers do adjust their behavior based on contextual factors that are out in the roadway. So as I mentioned, in the observational study, we looked at 4 different locations. People at a straightaway, when they're moving at an intersection, stopped at the intersection, or negotiating at a roundabout. And, what we saw is that, for the situations that are relatively less demanding, such as being stopped in the intersection, you can see that the more demanding, more challenging task, like manipulating a cell phone, the percentage of people who were manipulating a cell phone went up when they were stopped at an intersection. When they were eating or drinking, that increased in this less demanding driving situation. And then probably the most demanding situation of the 4 would be negotiating a roundabout. If any of you are familiar with having to drive through roundabouts, and you can see how drivers adjusted their behavior in response to that. The percentage of drivers who observed manipulating a cell phone was much lower. Same with eating and drinking. So this slide just breaks out the observations of drivers who were observed manipulating a cell phone by the driving situation and their estimated age. And, I did this because of the emphasis on teen drivers, and you can see that, even the teens are adjusting their behavior based on context. The percentage of drivers who were observed manipulating a cell phone much higher when the under 20 group was stopped at an intersection compared to the other 2 conditions in this slide. So I wanted to shift from talking about what we've seen from these on-road observational studies to talk a little bit about crash risk from engagement and different distracted driving behaviors. And we believe that probably the best source for estimating crash risk comes from naturalistic driving studies, but it's a really pretty challenging task to come up with good risk estimates, and this was especially true of the early naturalistic driving studies. So the whole concept of naturalistic driving studies it's kind of like observation on steroids. So you basically have multiple cameras in the vehicle. They're recording views of the forward roadway, the rear view, the driver's face, the in-vehicle display and controls. There are sensors that are installed in the vehicle to record following distance, closing speed, acceleration, and so forth. And the notion is that if you put this equipment in enough people's cars and follow the people for a long enough time, that you'll get really good in-depth insight into normal everyday driving. But in addition to that, over time, you'll see a number of crashes. And so that you can go back and look at all of the data that you've been recording and look at causal and contributing factors. And from that, you can generate estimates of risk. And so the earlier studies, they did do this. Basically, what they would do is estimate risk by comparing the presence of a certain behavior during a crash to behavior during normal driving periods when the driver wasn't engaged in any behavior at all. So the issue is that in these early studies, there were a small population of crashes. And so what the researchers did to supplement and increase that crash population was to include near misses or other crash surrogates to up that crash population so they could come up with more accurate risk estimates. But it's really important to emphasize that the estimates that came out now from once they've added these near misses, they're not estimates of crash risk, but they're actually estimates of crash or near crash risk. And it seems like it's kind of splitting hairs, but it's a very important point to make because surrogates can differ in a lot of ways from actual crashes. So that limitation has been addressed somewhat by the most recent naturalistic driving study, the SHARP 2 study, much bigger sample, 3,000 drivers. They were followed for a lot longer period of time, and they were followed more recently. So you can see that there were close to 1,500 crashes in the database. A lot of these crashes were minor, but Virginia Tech, they managed the database that was generated from this work. And the Guo et al. Study came from Tech, and they produced the first estimates of crash risk from the SHARP 2 dataset. And so what they did was to first estimate the prevalence of different behaviors by sampling video clips, and the number of video clips they sampled were proportional to the amount of driving that each participant did. And then they went and estimated crash risk by comparing the presence of the distraction in the seconds up to and during the crash to periods when the driver wasn't distracted at all. And so this figure is showing the prevalence of, I sampled 6 behaviors out of a host of behaviors that they looked at in that study. And so you can see that the most common behavior when they were looking at video clips that didn't involve crashes, the most common behavior was interacting with a passenger across all age groups, although you can see that it was more common among the youngest drivers. And it's also interesting or important to point out that the prevalence of interacting with a cell phone in some visual manual way, so looking at it, pressing buttons on it, it was much more common for the 16 to 20-year-olds and the 21 to 29-year-olds than it was for the 2 oldest age groups. So this next slide is presenting the odds of being involved in a crash when the drivers were engaged in these 6 different secondary behaviors. So a couple things to point out here on the slide. If the bar has a black outline around it, that indicates that there is a significant increase in risk associated with that behavior compared to periods when the driver was sober, attentive, and not engaged in any distracting behavior. So, for example, you take that first bar all the way to the left. For drivers in the age 16 to 20, um, the odds of being in a crash when talking on a cell phone was 2 times greater than when they were driving without any distraction. So it's really important when you're looking at this figure that you go back to this figure and consider the prevalence of the behavior in conjunction with the risk. So for just as an example, if you look at the drivers in the 65 to 98 age range, the use of visually manually interacting with a cell phone was really rare. That age group engaged in that 0.7% of the video clips. So that goes a long way into explaining this giant 24 times greater crash risk for that behavior. And then on the other hand, you have, we know that the youngest drivers on the roads get in trouble when they're interacting with passengers. That's why there are passenger restrictions in GDL laws. You can see here that, compared to the other behaviors that are in this chart, that interacting with the passenger had the lowest odds of crash risk. However, it was statistically significant, and if you go back to the prevalence, that was the most common behavior that the drivers were engaged in. So one other thing to point out, for the 2 youngest age groups, all 6 behaviors resulted in significant increases in crash risk compared to when they were just driving. And these included distractions that aren't necessarily visually demanding, whereas for the oldest age groups, we saw that only the really visually demanding tasks were associated with increases in distraction. So in the few seconds that I have to finish up here, I just want to reiterate that distracted driving isn't limited to cell phone use. We know that teens are overrepresented in distracted driving fatalities, even though we don't necessarily believe the numbers from the total numbers there. And we have a lot of information about the different things that drivers do when they're on the road. And that, we know that they do try to adjust for risk and try to manage the overall workload by seeing how engagement in these behaviors change across different settings. That being said, we know from the SHARP 2 program that, for teens and young adults, just about anything that they were engaged in that wasn't driving was associated with a significant increase in crash risk, whereas for the older adults, it's really those tasks that are visually demanding that were associated with the greatest risk. And really, for all age groups, any task that has a high visual manual demand is going to be associated with the greatest increase in crash risk. So that kind of wraps up the information that I had. I'm going to turn things over to Dennis, and I look forward to questions at the end.
Dennis, we believe that your phone line is still on mute. Please bear with us for just a moment while we work out this technical difficulty. Thank you. Okay. Dennis is coming right back to us. Please hold.
Okay, can we hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you, Dennis.
Sorry about that. I'm not sure what I did, but anyway. So I'm going to talk to everyone today about distraction and hazard perception training for young drivers, specifically a couple programs that were developed under some NHTSA funding, and Ian was actually a part of these way back in the day when they started many years ago. But I first want to point out you should be absolutely terrified every time you get on the road because of the young drivers that are out there. If any of you have had the privilege of training a young driver or do so as your profession, you know pretty well that novices, when they're first learning to drive, do not pay attention to the road. They are so focused on trying to put their hands in the correct position, pressing the correct pedal, that half the time they're not even looking at the road. And if they are looking at the road, they're not actually thinking about what they're looking at. If they do happen to look, they're not looking in the right places for threats. And you know, when they do look, they don't always receive pertinent information. They may not realize that there's a sign they should be looking at, and they may not perceive a threat. So one thing I want to ask everybody is, if you've believed that novices aren't doing all of these things, they can't project, they can't react, should we train young drivers on how to look away from the forward roadway to do in-vehicle tasks? And right now we have about 50-50 split, exactly 50-50. So again, should we be training people how to look away from the forward roadway to do in-vehicle tasks? And it is right on 50-50 for those that have responded. Exactly 50% say yes and no. And the answer is, it depends on what you mean. With today's cars, when you think about all of the technologies that are in the vehicles, from GPS programs to just the audio controls to seat warmers and everything else, it's almost impossible for people to not look in the vehicle. So I like to take the other side of it and frame it as, maybe we should be training people to look at the road when they're conducting these tasks and how to do it properly. One program that actually attempted to do this, and we'll talk about whether or not it's successful, was the Forward Concentration and Attention Learning program that was developed by UMass Amherst. The focus of this program is really teaching teens what a 2-second or less glance feels and looks like. So it's really the focus of, what does a glance away from the road feel like when you do it? First, you have to complete a driving task, but you also have to complete a secondary in-vehicle task. Here it was a map task where you had to find some streets on a map. The key here was, though, is when you did one task, the other was blacked out while you were driving. So here, just to give you an idea, so here was the forward roadway. It was a video, and your task was to, when a road sign or pedestrian or other hazard passes through these gray bars, hit the space bar just to acknowledge that you saw it. Now, while you're also doing that, we want you to find these streets on here. You see Grayton Street, Kelly Street, and Canyon Street on the map. But when you go to find those, guess what happens? It blocks out the road view. So it's just like you taking your eyes off the roadway. And as you can imagine, the first time somebody does this, they have a difficult time with it. So the focal program included a pretest to see how they would do on this map task and the driving task. Then they did some training after that, and then there was a post-test. The training, the first part of it was a feedback of long glances away from the road. So if you click down to the map task for like 8 or 9 seconds, this first part of the training would actually show you the road scene and say, oh my God, look at what you missed. And many of the young drivers kind of had aha moments because they would see, okay, we just drove through a stop sign. There were 2 pedestrians walking along the road that I never saw, all while I had my glance down trying to do the map task. The first actual training session then starts to show you what a short glance looks like. So it switches automatically from the map task to the video. Once you get to the second portion, it actually beeps at you when you've looked away too long. And it trains to these 3 and 2 second durations. So the whole point of the training is to get you to feel what a 2-second or less glance is. And here's just some quick results on the pre-test and the post-test. If you look at the graph on the left, this was for people who got the control training, so they actually did not get the focal training. And if you look at where I have the line drawn, right here, That's the percentage of glances that were greater than 2 seconds. And if you see, it's right about 70% on the pre-test, and it's also at 70% on the post-test. So if you had good control training, that's a good thing because they didn't get better and they didn't get worse. Now, when you look at our focal training, however, if you look at the same point on the pre-test, they had roughly about the same. 65 to 70% of their glances were greater than 2 seconds. But when you go down after they went through the focal training, less than 10% of their glances were actually greater than 2 seconds. And if you get over to 2.5 and 3 seconds, they had no glances that were longer than the 3-second interval. So to me, that says we've trained them to at least perform better on this computer task. So they kind of understand what a 2-second glance is. The next thing is to say, okay, well, what do they do when we actually get them out on the roadway? So, of course, we took them out on live roads in Milburn, New Jersey, which was not the most tame of environments, and asked these kids to actually do a variety of distracting tasks. Some of these were actually related to the vehicle controls, like turn on your high beams, turn on the front defroster, hit your emergency flashers. Several of the others were actually non-driving tasks. Find a CD, back when CDs were actually still relevant. The map task, find the radio station. And the one that baffled them all was finding correct change, because no teenagers can apparently make change these days. But we had them out on the road, driving around live traffic with a instructor in the dual control car, because it wouldn't be very safe to put them out there by themselves. And I or one of our other researchers was in the background, trying not to jump out of the side of the windows or anything else, as we almost crashed about 20 times. But as we were going along, we had these eye trackers that they wore. If you see here, it actually lets us see exactly where they're looking on the scene. And from that, we could actually calculate how long their glances from the, away from the forward roadway were. And what we found was that the focal training actually resulted in some shorter glances away from the roadway. For the vehicle task, if you look over here on the left, you'll see right here that on average, the maximum glance, so that's the longest glance they took during the task, for the vehicle task, was about 2.42 seconds for the focal group. For the placebo, it was about 2.67, and so that's about a quarter-second difference. That doesn't seem like a lot, but when you're traveling at 40 to 45 miles an hour, that's actually quite a bit of ground that you're covering. Now, when you get to the non-vehicle task, which were the CDs, the get change, and everything like that, we have, it was almost a 0.54 seconds, so a full half second that the focal training actually reduced their glances away. I think a key note here is that they never got below 2 seconds, though, but especially during those non-vehicle tasks, they seem to be glancing away for shorter durations than the kids who did not get any training. So the conclusions from this first, study here is that a short training program does appear to have some positive impact on glance behaviors. That is, that the training resulted in fewer very long glances away from the roadway, especially when they were doing some tasks that weren't related to driving. The follow-up here is that there have actually been no large-scale studies to see if this actually reduces crashes. So it's unknown if this training actually impacts young driver safety to this date. Now, another program, though, that has shown some promise when it comes to crashes is the Risk Awareness and Perception Training Program. This program assumes that your driver is actually looking at the roadway, but really focuses on teaching them how to anticipate hazards that have not actually materialized yet. So think ahead, project. Could something happen here? Is there something you're missing? Could a child dart out in front of you as a pedestrian hidden behind that car? The original version here used still frames, just pictures here, that progressed to show like you're going down the street, like you're following this bus here on the left. And once you got down to a certain point, you could click on these views and switch your view here. So a very kind of simple picture-based program. And it had very simple diagrams. It then said, okay, you're coming up to a traffic light here in this example. There's a large vehicle blocking the light. Here's what you should do. You should look over here for this light, and you should wait for the vehicle to clear out of the way. So in the field test, much like we did for the focal study, we took kids out, and lo and behold, they could actually anticipate hazards a lot better when you show this training to them and then take them out and say, let's drive around. So the next step was, okay, let's do a large field test. So what we did was we went out to California and worked with the California DMV and recruited over 5,000 teens to participate in the study. Half of them got the wrapped training and half did not. So if you look here, I want to focus here, we have our males, 16-year-olds, During this year-long study, so we had a year of their crash data after they agreed to participate, those who did not receive the training for 16-year-old males had 8 crashes per 100 drivers. If you look at 17-year-old males, you have a whopping 12.9 crashes per 100. 18-year-old males are not much better, 11.6. And then you have our females who tend to do much better in general compared to the males, especially the 17-year-old females who are much, much safer. Now, when you look at the wrapped training here, what we would love to see is a reduction in the crash rate after the training. For 16-year-old males who got wrapped, you actually see their crash rate was slightly higher. But then you get down to the 17 and 18-year-old males, you see that the crash rate for 17-year-old males was 7.4 per 100 drivers. You compare that to 12.9, that's about a 43% reduction for 17-year-old males. You have a very similar reduction for 18-year-old males in crashes. And then you get down to the females, and you see they're just slightly higher, actually. The important thing to note here is that none of these increases that you see for the 16-year-old males or the females were statistically significant, whereas if you look at the reductions for the male 17 and 18-year-olds, it does become statistically significant. Not only is it large, but in a statistical sense, it is meaningful and believable. So the large-scale field test said, wow, RAPT is associated with a significant decrease in crash rate for males. But oddly, females exposed to RAPT showed a slightly higher crash rate, but it was non-significant. So we use statistics in our favor there and say that it made males safer and didn't hurt females at least. So the next step in the sequence was, so we've got this RAPT program that with very simple pictures could actually potentially increase safety for teen drivers. So let's bring it into the 21st century and develop the Super RAPT program with some updated graphics. And the way we did this was we actually have 5 video cameras that are integrated into a single seamless video that allows you to pan 180 degrees. What I've had to do here is actually take screenshots of the actual program, so that's, if it looks a little distorted, that's why. But this is actually a scene where you would see about a third of it, and you can scroll right or left as if you're actually driving the vehicle, and the goal is to click on potentially hazardous situations or places that you should be looking while you're driving. The next thing we did for Super RAPT was we actually updated all of the animations, so you have actual animations, not just still pictures. And you could zoom in to the driver's seat over here with simulations. And then we also added some feedback too, both either if you got something right or you didn't get it right, the program explicitly tells you, okay, good job, or it says, hey, you missed it here. You know, after you've gone through it a couple times, it would say, okay, let's move on to the next one. And here again, you can see just the graphics and everything, all these animations. Again, if this was a live demonstration, you could see how everything's moving. And again, here's a scenario that shows the truck. And then you get into the actual video that shows the same situation. And so the goal of this field test was very similar to what we did with everything else. First, we wanted to see, did they actually learn anything through the computer training? And this graph shows you pretty clearly that our novice drivers who got the RAPT training, this first bar, showed a large and significant increase in the number of correctly identified hazards during the computer training. It's the same thing for the older group. We actually had a group of college-age students who have been driving at least 3 to 4 years, and they also showed enormous gains in the number of hazards that they identified in the test. Interestingly, the placebo group, who got a video on something like changing your tire, also showed some increases in performance. We believe this is likely due to the high-fidelity nature of the pre-test and the post-test. For this one, it was very clear you might have missed something the first time through, but if you were actually actively scanning here, you would actually, the hazard was very recognizable. So we think people, just by simply taking the test, started to actually learn something. We then had them come back a month later and do the same computer test, and you see a little bit of a drop-off here for the novice group and the older groups, but they still were better than those who had not received the training. And like everything we like to do, we like to take people out in the field again and see if they can actually apply it on live roadways. So we took them out on a drive around the university, and we had 25 possible hazardous areas or situations that we had identified. We once again put the eye trackers on them and said, okay, let's see how many of them actually focus on these hazardous areas. And if you look, our novice wrapped groups hit about 19. Our older wrapped group hit about 19, which is significantly higher than those who had gotten the placebo training. So the novices without training on average hit about 14 and a half of the hazards, and our older group actually got about 16. So you're seeing, at least 3 to 4, almost 5 more hazards identified by this group after they receive the training. Again, that is indicative that the training, that people are actually learning something. They are applying it out in the field where it may be very different than the training itself. And we think that this new and improved program, aside from just being sexier, is at least as effective, if not more effective, than the old program. So what this all comes to is that a short computer program, we believe, based on this research, can be used to teach novices to better anticipate hazards. Again, this is thinking ahead. This is the planning. This is kind of the higher order skills that they may not get just in basic driver education. And when you looked at wrapped, it looks like it may be related to a crash reduction. This would be about the first time ever that any driver education program has been related to a crash reduction. I think it's important to point out that our research also suggests that attention maintenance, or distraction, however you want to describe it, and hazard perception may be two different things altogether, that they're independent constructs. Because some of the research that I didn't present here actually shows that if you train somebody with focal, it doesn't necessarily mean they anticipate hazards better. And vice versa, just because you train somebody with wrapped doesn't mean they have managed their glances better. So it's really, you need both depending on what you're trying to accomplish. If you want to make somebody look at the forward roadway more and want them to actually perceive hazards, you might actually need to give them both. And so the final thing here is that, we've done a lot of this kind of in controlled situations in a laboratory or in a DMV office where we had control over the participants and how a program was administered, but it's really unknown how these programs would work as part of a driver education or GDL program. And so after hearing, how these programs have worked for us, I was going to ask another poll question here of, if we can get our poll question up. That's the first one. Okay, so if you think these programs should be included in driver training, where/when is the best time to administer programs like these? So far, everybody is saying classroom driver ed. We got a couple parent tots. Now we have some professional on-road. Now we're getting, the great majority of the people are just saying right now that classroom driver ed. And again, I'm asking that simply because that's a question I'm being asked all the time right now is when and where do you give these? I don't know if you should give these when the young drivers have not even hit the roadway yet. If you believe these are higher order skills, should you be doing them later on at a different portion of GDL? That's a question that remains to be answered, and hopefully soon we'll be answering that with some new studies. That is all for me.
Okay. Thank you, Dennis and Ian, for those great presentations. A lot of information there, and I want to invite our audience to ask questions of both of our presenters. All you need to do is type your question into the box in the bottom left of your screen, and I will read the questions as they come in. So we already have a number of questions in the queue, and we'll start with the question that would be addressed to Ian. This came up during your presentation. Our participant asked, how did you estimate handheld and hands-free phone conversations? I'm not sure if you remember which slide that's referring to.
Okay, that would be the, I'm assuming that is the slide that was from the NOPIS work, that it's a National Occupant Protection Use Survey that NHTSA does annually, and with that they also do the observations of cell phone use. So for handheld cell phone conversation, if a driver was seen holding a phone up to their hand and talking, then that would be observed handheld phone conversation. Estimated handheld or hands-free phone conversation, that would be situations where the observers are looking at a driver who was engaged in a conversation at the observation site, but they weren't seen physically holding a phone.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And yes, that was the slide that the participant was referring to, so thank you.
Yep.
Dennis, Dennis, can you discuss software or apps to help control teen use during drive times? Anything that's on your
As far as actual
radar?
on the cell, like something on the cell phone, is that what we're talking about?
I'm not sure what the participant is referring to exactly.
Well, I see
But
a
I
few
know we've
different
heard of a
questions.
lot of. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say there's several questions I kind of see along the software lines. Some of it is,
Yeah.
is SRAPT available? Right now, I am the one and only holder of the SRAPT program, and NHTSA is working on a way to distribute it. Right now, if you email me, I should be able to get you a copy, either through Dropbox or some other way, but it is a self-contained app that runs locally on a computer. Focal is not available yet. It's still kind of in the design stages, kind of university type setting. Now, as far as other apps and things to reduce distraction for teens, a lot of that is still voluntary. As far as putting it on, and then the parents are relying on the teens to not turn it off, and activate it. There's other stuff about geofencing where you can track your teens, you can track your speed. I'm sure a lot of you have seen the camera systems now that you can put in that alert you when there's been a sudden acceleration or deceleration, and you can review the video. So there's a lot of stuff out there on the software side. From the training side, there has not been a lot. Again, and until the auto manufacturers or the cell phone providers or cell phone manufacturers actually, decide that they're going to step up and lock these devices while they're in motion, or the system can't work, the vehicle system can't work while you're in motion, like a lot of GPS systems. You're stuck on this voluntary, management of your distractions.
Mm-hmm. Great.
And that's where I think the focals and the. No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Nope, I was going to say that. And I think that's where programs like Focal and SRAPT, if you kind of accept that people are going to do these activities, I think you have to take some way to train them to safely do them. Kind of like the old sex education in high school. Do you want to, do you want to train all the teens to do these things? But if you accept that they're going to do this, I think it's best if you find a way to train them to do it safely. So
safely. Got it. Thank you. And could you just remind us the acronym SRAP? What does that stand for?
That stands for Super RAPT. RAPT is the Risk Awareness and Perception Training Program.
Great.
And I put several references throughout my presentation in there to reports that are published and freely available about the programs and the evaluations.
Great. Thank you very much. There are a number of questions about policies. Several of our participants would like to know what are the best policies that are being used by states or communities to control or eliminate distracted driving among teens. Can either or both of you address that question?
I can. This is Ian. I can take a first attempt at answering it. So, I know that there are just about every state bans teens as part of their GDL laws, bans teens from sending text messages, and the majority of states also have cell phone bans for teens built into the GDL programs. And we know from work that NHTSA has done to evaluate the effectiveness of handheld cell phone bans, that those laws do effectively reduce the prevalence of using a handheld phone. But when the Institute has done studies looking at the effects of crashes in those states that have had the bans, we're not seeing the effects on in terms of a crash reduction. So, from our perspective, I have not seen policies, effective laws to address teens distracted driving.
I think the most important thing for is you can develop the best policies and legislation and, but if law enforcement can't enforce it, and I work with law enforcement all over the country, and that's what I constantly hear about distracted driving laws is that I cannot enforce this. Even if I pull somebody over and I see them holding a phone up and talking on it, if they say I wasn't talking on it or I was, talking to Siri, that they may
We're
just turn
navigating.
off. Or navigate, anything like that. So that's been
Right.
one of the biggest problems. I know in New York right now there is actually a technology called the textilizer that is being considered. It actually basically can read your cell phone and see if you were texting, talking, or otherwise doing something you shouldn't have been while you were driving. It's the first of its kind to look at all that without actually revealing any identifying information, which everybody's concerned about right now. But basically, a police officer could hook up this device to your cell phone. He can say, I saw you texting, hook it up, and say, okay, it confirms that you were texting 30 seconds ago when I say I saw you. But again, that's the type of technology that is just now coming available, but is not, accepted anywhere yet. From a law enforcement perspective, it is virtually impossible to enforce these laws.
And I would just also add on to my answer, as far as policies that do work, we know that strong GDL programs are effective, including passenger restrictions. Those are probably more easily enforceable than cell phone bans. Those passengers are distractions for teens too. So the stronger the GDL law is, I think the net benefit for teen driving safety is going to be is better.
And just to add on another point to that is, in our program in California when we did the big RAPT study out there, roughly half of our participants were 18 years old when they entered. Most of those 18-year-olds, I would venture, did not have driver education. Basically, they had gone around and waited to get their license without going through GDL. So until you extend GDL basically to all ages, all novice drivers, you lose some of the benefit.
Okay, thank you. So, somewhat related to that, one of our participants asked, what is the relationship of fatal crashes due to distracted driving with the length of time with license? Can you address that, either or both of you?
Ian, I think you addressed that somewhat in your presentation.
Yeah, I would, I would say the relationship between to repeat back the question, they're asking about the relationship to the length of time for licensure and involvement in distracted driving crashes.
Relationship of fatal crashes due to distracted driving with length of time of license.
That's tough because again we're going back to that the FAR system, the fatality analysis reporting system. We don't really believe that those numbers are accurate. That they just don't provide an accurate estimate of the traffic fatalities that are occurring because of distraction. So, it's really hard to get an answer to a more detailed research question like that. When we're working with a data set that we don't believe the numbers of.
Well, I think just from a psychological perspective and, kind of learning, once you learn to drive and have been driving for a while, it becomes automatic. It goes into procedural memory. So it would make sense that you would have more, cognitive resources available to do other tasks, so to speak, or you might pick a more appropriate time to do those tasks, say when you're stopped or when you're off the road, versus I think when you're a young driver and you haven't mastered the motor skills necessary to drive and you try to do the distracting task, I would have to believe that your crash risk is much higher, either because you didn't make a good decision about when to do the distracting task or because you simply didn't have the cognitive resources to execute that and actually drive at the same time.
Yeah, I do agree that makes sense, but if, just thinking about the most recent SHARP 2 naturalistic driving study, based on the argument that, you build up through driving experience over the first couple years, you kind of insulate yourself and reduce your potential for being involved in a distracted driving crash. And we're not talking fatal crash, but just a distracted driving crash. But the SHARP 2 data is suggesting that, you know, the young adults who are 21 to 29 years old, and you know, assuming they've been driving for longer than the 16 to 20-year-olds that were in that study, some of the risk estimates for the different behaviors for those young adults are higher than they were for the teens. So, you know, I think that there's something going on there. There's definitely a benefit to having driving experience. Like I agree with everything that Dennis has said. As you have more automatic behavior, you have more cognitive capacity to devote to other things. But you know, maybe there is greater prevalence of the behaviors as with the young adults, or maybe they're even taking more risks than they did when they were first starting out driving. So it's tough to say.
Tough to say. Okay. Well, thank you so much for taking the questions, answering them. There's still a lot of information. I know that both of you have, and there are a number of questions, but most unfortunately, we've come to a close of today's webinar. It's now 3 o'clock. So I want to thank our presenters, Dr. Ian Reagan of the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety and Dr. Dennis Thomas of Dunlap and Associates for their fabulous presentations. And thank you, our audience, for your time today. Finally, we have a quick evaluation of today's session, and we hope you'll take a moment to complete this. And hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.